Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable.
Mubarak has been an ally of ours. I would not refer to him as a dictator.
An orderly transition must be meaningful, it must be peaceful, and it must begin now.
Now started yesterday.
The people of Egypt have spoken, their voices have been heard, and Egypt will never be the same.
Welcome back. Some of the statements made by the Obama administration as it tried to keep up with events in Egypt. We're joined now on our roundtable by George Will, Ariana Huffington, Robert Kagan of the Brookings Institution, and the Egyptian journalist Mona Eltahawy. Thank you all for being here. What an amazing week. George, to you first. You've heard on this program and at CPAC the fierce criticisms of President Obama by the Republicans on how this was handled. Fair play?
Not fair. These conservatives have a kind of bifurcated mind. They say at home, rightly, the government exaggerates its competence, its ability to manage a complex society. Then overseas, they fault the government for not fine-tuning an extraordinarily fluid event. The administration has not gotten ahead of events because no one knows where the events are heading. Right now, we're in the second inning of a 9-inning game. We have, on the government side, Bonapartism without a Bonaparte, which is a good thing. The last thing you want is a Bonaparte. On the protesters' side, you have no Lech Walesa, no Václav Havel, extraordinary unled spontaneousness about this. And that means there's a obviously continuing danger. 1952, Nasser comes to power. 1954, millions of Egyptians go into the streets saying, we don't like what looks like a military regime. Nasser says, not to worry, we're going to have elections. Protesters get arrested, and a military dictatorship is screwed down on the country.
And Mona, precisely, there's been military rule since 1952, and as George says, no one of those great inspirational leaders from the Eastern European revolutions. What do you think is the next move?
I think the opposition is talking, and I think the opposition is coming up with this organic leadership that is what makes this revolution so beautiful. But I think what will help them, Christian, is ending the cynicism that exists everywhere in DC. I mean, I'm appalled as an Egyptian living through the most historic time of my life that, first of all, with Tunisia, no one thought Tunisia could do it. And then they said no one but Tunisia could do it. Then it started in Egypt and said, no, it's not going to work. And then it worked in Egypt, and now they're saying, no, they're not going to put it off. The Muslim Brotherhood, the army, and nowhere else in the region is this going to happen. So I'm here in DC thinking, you know what? I want to bring that freedom rally that is sweeping across the region to DC so that people here can start believing that people power counts, you know, and that will help people in Egypt.
Will it happen in the domino theory? Bob?
I think we're seeing unquestionably a new moment in the Arab world, and that there's ferment all these old corrupt dictatorships which have been, clamping down on their people for decades, and which we have supported in the interest of stability. I think that those days are over. And now, although I agree with George, it's very hard to fine-tune these things, but there is a sense of getting ahead of the curve and at least being where history is going. And I think it's very important the United States do that now. Well, I think we do have to do what we didn't do in Egypt over the past couple of years, which is press for gradual reforms so that you don't wind up creating a tinderbox that explodes. There are reforms that can be undertaken in Jordan. There are reforms that can be undertaken in Algeria and elsewhere. It's not going to be easy, but you do have to start pressing in that direction.
And actually, in a very prescient article, Bob said that just before the uprising started, and we've been looking the other way in country after country in the Middle East, and this is the time to actually demand some gradual but real reforms. But right now, Christian, there's been a perfect storm of three conditions. The growing connectivity in the Middle East, phenomenal. What is happening, 5 million people on Facebook in Egypt. There's been the growing unemployment among the young, which has been a tinderbox, especially after the global recession. And also there's been this real organization of 12 to 15 real leaders, including Ghanem from Google, who've been doing a lot of very creative and very important things. And so even though there isn't a Lech Walesa, there is real leadership behind this movement.
Right, but let me ask about the sort of perhaps what was so last century, the foreign policy stability paradigm was about authoritarian leaders, thinking that it was stable. In 18 days, that stability just collapsed. So is stability, and should it be, faith in a democratic representative governments, no matter who they are?
Well, it depends. I mean, I'm not sure any of us here would rejoice if Pakistan said it was going to have elections in 60 days. Who knows who would win? You have to have some idea of the outcome of freedom before you can endorse freedom. But all modern tyrannies have depended on intellectual autarky, being able to seal off the consciousness of their people from the outside world, and that's the connectivity that you're talking about. Can't be done anymore. And that may be the case then that tyranny is just not feasible anymore, in which case the old theory of the Arab exception, that somehow the Arabs are exceptionally immune to the democratic wave, has to be rethought.
Absolutely.
You know what's changed also, Christian, and this ties it into social media and people like Wael Ghunaim. Since social media started spreading across the Arab world, and you had a generation that has always been marginalized and told, you do not count, everyone started realizing, I count. That is an incredible force, I count, against this dictator who always told you, I am the country, and I count. So I think what we heard from President Obama's speech, this moment of clarity, was his understanding that stability does lie with the people and the people counting, rather than a dictator and what he used to promise.
And as George said, you have to know what freedom is before you can endorse it. Is that realistic?
Well, again, you can't say, unless we have a 100% guarantee that we're going to get exactly the outcome we want in an election. I don't think George is saying that. Then we can't support an election. We have made the mistake of thinking that dictators were our friends in this struggle. But even in Pakistan, the generals who controlled Pakistan, Zia and Musharraf, Islamic radicalism flourished under them, in fact, almost as a conscious tactic, and Mubarak the same. And so we've been under the illusion that these dictators were somehow bulwarks against radicalism, and we need to understand that stability is not dictatorship. Stability may mean a gradual change toward genuine democratic society.
But also many powers are sort of, including Iran, are under the illusion that they can control what's happening. Whether we endorse it or not may be irrelevant. Whether Iran calls for an Islamic revolution as it did or not is irrelevant, because this is not an Islamic revolution. There are Christians and Muslims, and it has a real non-ideological tenor, which is what makes it so strong.
Well, let me actually ask you to elaborate on that, because clearly everybody is terrified that what's going to happen in Egypt is another Iran. Is that a real fear today?
No, Egypt is not Iran, but more simply, the Muslim Brotherhood represent maybe 20% of Egyptians. If you were to ask me what ideal government would take over in Egypt, I would like, or would be elected, no more takeover, would be elected in Egypt. For sure, the Muslim Brotherhood will be represented, as they should, but it will be so many other Egyptians. Now, you remember when you spoke to Hosni Mubarak last week, Christian, he told you, Egyptians don't understand, you don't understand our culture. And Suleiman told you, Egyptians don't understand democracy. Look at what an insulting approach they had to their own people. People in the streets of Egypt told them, we do understand democracy and we're ready for it. In that democracy is the Muslim Brotherhood, but they will not take over.
Bob, isn't one of the ways to encourage democracy in a sort of an orderly fashion, if you like, the US has that ability through its NGOs, it hasn't done it, particularly under this administration?
Well, unfortunately, when the administration came to office, the mantra of foreign policy was whatever Bush did, we're not doing. So Bush had aid going into democracy organizations, NGOs in Egypt, and the first thing the Obama administration did, unfortunately, was cut that off. I think that our aid now needs to be channeled precisely to make up for the deficiencies that Mubarak created, to help secular political parties, to help liberal political parties organize and put themselves on a level where they can compete evenly with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the only group that Mubarak did allow to organize. And yes, the United States does have an important role in doing this.
And we have this leverage of the $2 billion that we give Egypt every year. Of course, let's compare that to the $2.8 billion that we spend on Afghanistan every week, just to see how we also need to refigure our priorities in the globe.
Well, what we want to do is help them get where we got, where multi-party countries. In 1789, we ratified the Constitution. Everyone was agreed we shouldn't have political parties. They were bad things. Instantly fell to creating political parties because they're absolutely essential. The question is, how fast can this spontaneous combustion become institution building? And we're pretty good at that. We know how to do that.
So helping through the foreign aid budget, I mean, really using that strategically.
The National Endowment for Democracy. There are all kinds of people in this town who spend their entire lives thinking about this. Tap what they know.
A lot of institutions that Ronald Reagan set up during what is now known as the Great Wave of democratization that occurred in the late 70s and then on through the 80s.
So hopefully that won't be slashed in this deficit busting mania.
It would be foolish. It would be the most foolish strategic decision we could make.
It's a rounding error on the General Motors bailout.
In Egypt, it's important to remember we have a history of political parties, Christian, because before 1952, we had many problems in Egypt, especially the poverty gap, but we had a vibrant parliamentary democracy of sorts, despite British occupation and the monarchy. We had political parties, we had prime ministers that would come and go, Muslim and Christian. We have that history in Egypt. We need to revive that history and make it more equitable.
And a very good note on which to stop and to continue this discussion in the green room at abcnews.com/thisweek, where you can also find our fact checks in conjunction with PolitiFact.